So tonight I'm going to share some stories of places that I have visited. In my research, I travel around the United States and I go to congregations where people are actually taking action and doing wonderful things. And I ask them, how did you make this work? Because I think we can all learn from their stories. So I'm going to share those stories because I think the more stories we know of what other people are doing, the more ideas we have for figuring out what we can do here in our own community. We'll start with Trinity Presbyterian Church in Virginia. Trinity has a somewhat unusual structure. They have what they call house churches through which they do ministry. So if at Trinity you wanted to take up some cause, you saw a need in the community, you would go back to the congregation and you would say, hey, are there other people who share my interest in providing food to the poor or developing a clothing closet so that people can have clothing for their job interviews and things like that. And other people would say, yes, that's a good idea, and that would become a ministry group with a house church. Back in 1996, a group of members at Trinity formed a house church focused on restoring creation. Now, every house church has to do what are called 4 marks, or 4 areas of activity, because each house church is understood to be a miniature version of the entire church, with an obligation to do everything that's done in the main church. So they do theological study, or nurture, to look at how the topic that interests them is actually connected to their faith. For the Restoring Creation House Church, this meant studying things like the Presbyterian Church's report on restoring creation for ecology and justice. A report that talks about how Presbyterian beliefs are connected not only to the health of ecosystems, but also to social justice, because some people are unfairly impacted by the effects of our pollution, and the things that go on in the northern hemisphere do damage to the southern hemisphere. There are all kinds of justice issues around the environment. They also have a mission. They have to figure out what actions will they take to fulfill their mission. And for the Restoring Creation House Church, currently renamed the Earth Care House Church, the mission is to promote church and community awareness and involvement in restoring creation. So they do a lot of educational activities to let people know about what's going on in the area. But they also do community work. They go out and try to do advocacy in the community. They do worship. Every time they meet, they actually hold a worship service, a miniature version of what goes on a Sunday. And once a year, they lead the Sunday service for the church. It will not surprise you to know they get to lead the Earth Day Sunday worship every year. And fellowship is also an important part of this. This is a group that shares each other's joys and concerns. They build relationships and community to support each other. And that becomes a foundation then for keeping their hopes up when things are difficult. So for the first few years after this was founded in 1996, they mostly did a lot of study and worship, and they would hold worship services outdoors. But Lynn Cameron, who was one of the founders of this church, she said, after a while, after we'd really studied and taken in the theology, we felt the need to do more action. We wanted to take our beliefs and put them into practice. Now she said that study that we did, the theological foundations, were very important because we needed to understand that this really was a faith issue to care for the environment, to care for God's creation. She says the other thing is, we're in the South. And a lot of people think environmentalism is something only done by godless humanists. So if you're in the South and you're involved in environmental activity through your church, somebody's come to you and say, but you're a Christian. What do you care about the environment for? So it always helps to be able to give a good biblical response to that. The theological study was important for answering those questions. Now the image you see here, slightly different, this is part of Shenandoah National Park. And what motivated this community to start becoming more active outside of their church in worship and celebration of creation was the threat to Shenandoah National Park, a place they love, where they would take children from the church hiking, where they would go camping. Because Shenandoah National Park suffers from acid rain pollution, which is damaging the ecosystem. And when they started doing research on what was causing this pollution, they discovered it's not local. Coal-fired power plants generating electricity in West Virginia put particulate matter in the air that comes down in Virginia. So you can't even address this issue by going to your local people. Not even at the state level, it's another state. So you're really dealing with national energy policy if you want to address this problem. And as they started learning more about our energy policy and our coal-fired power plants, they learned about mountaintop removal coal mining. In the Appalachian Mountains, the coal seams are 500 feet from the top of the mountains. So the coal companies go in and they just chop off the top of the mountain and dump it in the valley. Now the Mining Reclamation Act says you have to restore it to the way it was. So they fly over with non-native grass seed and sprinkle it, and it comes up from one season and then dies back. The mining companies will actually tell you they're doing people a favor by creating flat land in a very hilly place so they can put shopping malls and golf courses on them. And in the meantime, they're destroying the water supply, they're contaminating the streams, they're creating holding tanks of waste that you see, we get breaks and floods and all kinds of damage. And the reason they do this kind of mining is it's the only way to make mountain mining as cheap as the big pit mines out in Wyoming, so they can compete on the coal market and they can send this coal to Michigan to light our lights through consumers' energy. So in studying this group of people in this house church, a dozen people, trying to figure out how do we, as this little group of people, do something about something so big. And they decided God doesn't call us to do little things. We have to try to take action. We have to try to do something about this. Well, the minister had a suggestion. She said, why don't you take a resolution to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA, the annual meeting for the entire denomination of the largest group of Presbyterians in this country, meets every year, and see if you can get all the other Presbyterians in the country, or at least a lot of them, to start working on this issue too. So they worked with a lawyer to craft a resolution, and in 2002, they went to the General Assembly meeting and they presented their resolution, which would ask that the Presbyterian Church USA send information to all congregations throughout the United States to educate the members about the effects of coal-powered pollution on ecosystem health and human health. And also to ask that members of the Presbyterian Church, whenever they had an opportunity, speak to their representatives about the need to enforce our existing clean air laws. Because what's going on here is that old coal-fired power plants are grandfathered in, so they don't have to meet the regulations that have been put into place. So that's the other thing they should be asking their representatives to do. Get rid of the grandfather clause. And then go a step further, let's have better new laws and take things to a higher level, because clean air is something we all deserve to have. And then finally, they would ask that the lobbying arm of the Presbyterian Church USA in Washington, D.C. lobby at that level. You may not know this, but all of the mainline churches have lobbyists in Washington, D.C. They're doing work for you all the time, putting your values into practice. This resolution passed unanimously at the General Assembly meeting. So since 2002, this has actually been part of the regulations of what should be out there for Presbyterians throughout this country. The problem is most of you probably haven't even heard about it. There's a difference between what happens in General Assembly and what happens in your home congregation. But that's there. You can act on it at any time. As Presbyterians, and anyone else, you're all invited. This is available to you. So here was this group of 12 people. We're just a little house church, what can we do? And suddenly it's like, hey, we got the entire denomination backing us on this issue. Lynn said, after that, there was no stopping us. Once we saw what we could do. Now, of course, it's one thing to talk the talk. You gotta walk the walk. So going back home, they started really focusing on how do we put our values into practice. Make sure that our children have the skills to go on and carry this work forward The girls there are looking for crawdads on one of their church outings. You got to connect the children to nature so they'll want to protect it someday. But also, this church is literally in a house, and it's not a new house. This house was built in the 19th century. It has a new wing, which you can't really see off to the left, that's a little more modern. But the main building is this old house. And so they decided to weatherize it so that they could cut down on their energy use. And they turned it into a Sunday school project where they got the kids together and they taught them how to use different weatherization materials, how to use caulk and how to use weather stripping. And then they gave them sort of free rein and said, okay, problem solve, figure these things out. Here you've got a bunch of windows, what would you do with them? And the kids figured out whether to use weather stripping or caulking. And I was told there was this girl a group of tween girls, 11, 12-year-old, 13-year-old girls, they always move in packs. Right. She had this trio of girls, and one would take the little cloth and she'd go along and she'd clean the surface off. And the next one would come with a caulk gun and she'd run the bead of caulk. The third one would come with their finger and smooth out the caulk, and nobody wanted to do the other person's job. They each had their job, and they're just moving through the church, window by window, doing all of these things, weatherizing the church. And they did this over about 3 weeks before they'd actually gotten all the windows and doors improved. The children were asked, well, what are you going to do now that you finish the church? They said, oh, we're going to go home and do this at home. We're going to teach our parents how to do this. So you have this church project expanding outward into the community as these children take what they've learned and they take it home with them. Presbyterian Church actually has a Earth Care Congregation designation. If a church does enough things to incorporate environmental awareness into worship, education, and the functioning of the building through energy conservation, recycling, reducing the use of paper, toxics in the cleaning supplies, you can get designated as an Earth Care congregation. Trinity Presbyterian was the second church in Virginia to achieve that designation. They're very proud of it. You have to get something like 100 points, so it's not an easy thing to do. So we see here that this activity it's integrated into the church because it's seen as an expression of the church's mission. The church, Trinity Presbyterian's mission, is striving to be the church in the world through servant ministries. And this house church has become a servant ministry to restore creation, to care for the earth as an expression of their religious faith. They're motivated by concern for the natural environment like the Shenandoah Valley, and also social justice. They get a lot of support from the Reverend Ann Held, who's been pastor there since 1990. She's an avid hiker, camper. Her daughter grew up to go to the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment, which was how I discovered them. And she does preach about nature in her sermons as a place where one encounters God and a place where one learns about theological lessons. But the message that she's given that's probably the most powerful is that she tells the people in her community, God calls you to be faithful, not successful. And this gives people the courage to try big things that might not work out, to know that it's okay to fail, but you are called to be faithful, therefore you do have an obligation to try. So this motivates people to attempt things. You also see that the structure of the house church, that group faith development and group fellowship gives people the courage of their convictions and to know they have support from their community that they can go out and try things. And one of the things Lynn Cameron told me, I asked her, because she's a longtime Sierra Club person, I said, how does doing environmental work through your church differ from doing it through the Sierra Club? And she said, well, Sierra Club outings are great, but in our church, we take time to celebrate God's creation. And that gives us a greater strength to persevere than we get from those Sierra Club outings. So for her, that worship element actually was part of what made it possible to keep going from 1996 until today, working to protect God's creation. And because the entire community affirms the value of each house church's mission and says, yes, we will agree that this house church should be part of our church this year. They know that they are acting on behalf of the larger congregation, and that these values are part of the values of the entire church.